Happy Sunday. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Tech Talk. Today's topic is shaving 10 seconds off of your 500-meter pErg score. Pacing is the secret. My mission, again, is really to help develop community-focused paddler leaders. I want to not only help paddlers become better, but I also want to help paddlers then become leaders in their community to help grow paddling as a sport. I also want to provide mindset, technique, and coaching related talks to support paddler goals. The pErg is pretty much short for the paddle erg, and I put a picture of it down here. The paddle erg is pretty much a rower, and I like to use the concept two rowers because they're pretty much everywhere. They are in local gyms. Many people at home would have them to row and to work out on. So the concept two rower, you add the adapter on there, and so now you can use it as a paddling machine as opposed to just a rower. Okay, and so when we take a look at the paddle erg, I wrote down some pros and cons for the paddle erg. In terms of the pros, it can stimulate paddling on water, mainly the motion, right? So the technique of the paddling part, you can simulate that. The paddle erg is also a very controlled setting. There's no conditions, there's no water, wind, or things that can affect it. The machine is itself, and if you put someone else on, it's still the same controlled setting. There's no balance issues. So, for example, if it was an outrigger, people might struggle with balancing on it. For this, you can sit on it and you'll be able to go right ahead and using it. To me, it's a much smaller investment than having a canoe. A canoe can cost you, if it's a used one, maybe between 1,000 to 3,000. If it's a brand new one, closer to 5, 6,000, maybe even 7,000. Whereas the paddle erg, the rower is maybe $1,000, and the paddle adapter is $600 to $700. Okay, and then so that would be specifically this paddle erg. I think it takes up less space than a canoe. And so if you're strapped for space, you don't have storage, you don't have a car rack for a canoe, the paddle erg is a great investment option to get your training started right away. The other big pro for the Concept 2 paddle erg is that the PM5 monitor is able to track your workouts. You can send intervals in there, and then with erg data on your phone, you can connect all of that. And so it helps you to track all the workouts that you do in one space already. Okay. And so I wrote down also some of the cons of the paddle erg, and I wrote that it is a simulation at best, meaning you're not on the water. At the end of the day, you're training on land using a machine and you're not actually touching the water. You're not actually getting water feel from it. Okay. So with the paddle erg, there's no transfer from your hip and your legs. You're really just using that upper body to pull the rope, and not really transferring it to your hips, shoving the boat forward. So that's the big difference. And that's a big con because we all know someone might be really good at the paddle erg. They're getting such great scores, but then when you put them on the outrigger, they're not quite able to, or put them on the dragon boat, they're not quite transferring that power through the hips and the legs. Okay. Another con for the paddle erg, and a lot of people refer to this as like cheating the pErg. It's where people can pull really far back and get the rope to go really far back to cheat the stroke, meaning the machine thinks that you went a long distance on the water, but in reality, it was just you pushing the string. And it's a con because on the water, if you do that, you're not actually moving the boat. You're shoving your paddle, but it's not actually moving your boat forward. The other con is that you will need to store the adapter, and you also need to store the paddle, the rower. And so depending on where that space is at home, it could take up some space. The metal parts of the paddle erg is also kind of sharp, and it could be clunky. So if you're trying to take it off and on, trying to use it as a rower sometimes, and then as a paddle erg sometimes could become kind of a hassle to switch on and off. And so that's a con. Another con is that the rope can break. So you could be in the middle of your workout, you're going hard, and then it's gone. So why should we have the pErg as a training tool? Uh, Number one, I think the most important reason is that it's very easy to calibrate between people's scores. It also is very helpful in getting you in the paddling motion, right? So you can really take it slow. You don't have to worry about balance on the boat, on the outrigger. You don't need 20 people on a dragon boat to get the practice in. You can just sit on the machine and start practicing that motion. And a coach can really look at that motion too to give you an idea as to whether that motion is going to contribute to the water, to the boat moving forward or not. Also, you can record and share data. The last reason is that it's convenient to have at home. So let's say it's raining outside and it's windy and it's storming outside. You can still have the option of staying in at home and getting a good workout in. This is the PM5 monitor that I'm talking about. For the purpose of dragon boat paddling, uh, many of us use the 500-meter pErg test as a way to measure each person's output. When we take a look at the pErg monitor, it's important to demystify the pErg monitor because many of us, when you're brand new, you hop onto the pErg and the coach just says, just go. And then you go hard and then you don't know what you're looking at. Numbers are going up and down, but you don't know what they mean. So number one, that's the stroke rate right here. Okay, number two here, this is showing you the time. Number two here and number five here can be interchangeable in that right now, this monitor is set for a timed workout. So that's why it's counting down the time. If you're doing a distance workout, which is what we do for the 500-meter pErg, the distance will be displayed up here and it will count down how much more distance you have until you're completely done. Number three here is probably the most important, okay? It is important because this is telling you what your current stroke power level is. Pretty much the stronger you're paddling, the lower the split, right? Again, we're trying to finish the 500-meter as quickly as possible. So the lower the number, the faster you're completing that 500-meter piece. And so number four here is empty in this one, but it's actually to connect your heart rate monitor to the rower, and that will then display your heart rate here. Okay, and number five, this is, in this case, it's displaying you how many meters you've completed. So we're going to go into the secrets of pacing now. How do we shave off 10 seconds off of your 500-meter pErg score? The most important concept to get is that it's a numbers game. We need to look at that split always. And the reason is that because you're doing a 500-meter test, you're essentially trying to maximize your speed during that whole distance. You need to train on the pErg often enough to know what numbers in general you are going to get. If you keep at this power, that's how quickly you're going to finish your 500-meter piece. Okay. So if you're not getting on the pErg enough, it's hard to know what that number is going to be based on your power level. So when you're actually doing your test, you need to be watching your splits. And that's that big number that I was talking about. When I'm doing my pErg test, I'm watching those big numbers to make sure it's at the place where I anticipate it to be. So here's the scenario, right? Remember that the time is based on per 500, the split is based on per 500-meter pace. If you keep at 3 minutes, so that big number, if you keep it at 3 minutes for the entire 500-meter piece, what is your end time? The answer is 3 minutes. Exactly. Correct. Okay. Because you just sat at three minutes for the entire time. So it would take you 3 minutes to complete the 500-meter piece. Let's say this other paddler, for the first 250 meters, they were going all out and they got 2 minute split for the first 250. But then you fade super hard for the last 250 meters. You faded so hard that it was a 4 minute piece, 4 minute pace. What is your final time? The answer is also 3 minutes. Okay. So because for the first half, you're going at two, super strong, super fast, super fast. But then you just burned out. And so the second half, you're at four. Two for the first half, four for the second half. The average is three. So here are some common mistakes, okay? The most common mistake for many paddlers is that they go out too fast and then they fade very hard at the end. And that's what that 2 minute person then fading to the 4 minute person did. Here's another common mistake for people who do have paddle ergs, and that is testing too often to try to get faster. Testing too often to try to get those incremental gains usually will not get you faster. And think of it like studying for a test, right? If you went and you did a test, you took a test and you didn't get the score that you wanted, and you're like, oh, I know this stuff. I'm going to take the test again without studying, right? That's not going to work. So pretty much you got to study for the test. Another common mistake is that because someone might not be training often enough on the paddle erg, that they don't know their pace. They don't know the splits that they want to be hitting. And so they're just guessing based on how they feel. And that's not as great as having the right data points to help guide you to be successful. Do note that there are different pErgs out there. So concept two with the Vermont adapter, version two. There's also a Kayak Pro out there. Then there's also a Kaha adapter that I know of that is based out of Australia. And I wanted to give you an example of a test that I did. This was back in 2021, May of 2021. Okay. I wrote out the paces on this side. The final score that I got was 156.1 for a 500-meter piece. Okay, I have some heart rate data in there. My stroke rate was an average of 58. And so you can take a look, right? For the first 100, I was at 158.0. For the second 100, I was at 153.5. And for the third 100, I was again at the exact same 153.5. The fourth one, I was at 155. And the last 100, I was at 2 minutes and 2 minutes point five. Okay, again, the goal of pacing is that you know your numbers. And so for example, here, because I average 156, because I average 156, the idea should be that my first 100 should be at 156 and it should be at 156 all the way through, that I'm just consistent. Okay. So you can see here that based on these breakdowns of the 500, I had a slow start. So for whatever reason, I started and I was at 158 and I just held it there. And I do remember that I think that I didn't feel very confident in what I was able to produce. And so I said, my goal is to sit at 158. So I was actually going into it feeling that I'm going to sit at 158 and I'm going to finish the test and get 158. That is my pace and I'm going to stay there. I think I started and it felt good. So I sat at 158 for that first 100 and I was like, you know what? I'm just going to go for it, which I don't usually recommend, but I think that day I went for it. So I started pushing that rate down, pushing that pace down. I got to the 153. I'm like, man, it still feels good. Then I got to another 153. I'm like, man, it still feels good. And then by the fourth 100, I started fading. I was like, oh, I can't hold the 153 anymore, right? So aggressive second and third 100. I was holding it onto it on the fourth 100, and I just had a big fade on the fifth 100. So you can see that I was barely keeping it to under two. And then I ended up with the 156, mostly carried by the middle 300 meters. Okay. In order to shave off 10 seconds off of your next paddle erg score test, number one, you need to be training often, right? So you need to be training on the paddle erg, knowing what your numbers are. Don't test too often. Okay. So meaning we have to have a plan a month out so that you can try to hit that in a month's time. Okay. And then in terms of pacing, you want to be able to go in with an estimate as to where you think you're going to be. It's the same thing. You got to know where your pace is going to be. And then if you just carry that out, you would have gotten your pace. And that's great. If you're able to do it even better, then you can use that as a starting point and try to get a little faster. And that's how you shave off those seconds off of your PR time. There's a paddling community online where you can share your successes and paddling stories. And so if you're not on it yet, please feel free to jump on and I'll see you up there. All right. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. If that was valuable to you, please drop a comment, drop a like, or share it to a friend that you think will benefit from this. Thank you so much for tuning in.